Diane Bailey. I'm a senior scientist at the Natural Resources Defense Council.
And speak into the microphone, please, and hold it up like an ice cream cone.
Hey, and hopefully someone's loading my presentation. Boy, Greg Harris is a tough act to follow, but I'm going to try to tell you guys a little bit about the community and health impacts that we're facing here in the Bay Area with all of these massive oil terminal and refinery changing projects that we're facing. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to use my notes here. So we have at least 3 or more major oil terminal projects coming into the Bay Area, and you're going to hear about those in more detail. But I want to underscore how massive this change is to Bay Area refining. There's the potential within 6 months or a year to change about or replace about 1/4 to 1/3. There we go. About 1/4 to 1/3 of our oil refining capacity. It means new sources of crude oil. And
we can't hear you unless you speak into the mic.
okay.
Pretend you're a rock star.
Okay, thank you so much for the input. So we're looking at about 1/4 to 1/3 of the crude oil sources in the Bay Area changing. Those are major changes. And we weren't sure what to make of this with all the new projects coming into the Bay Area. What are these new crude sources? Where are they coming from? Is it potentially much dirtier oil, or are we talking about different sources of the same oil? We commissioned some expert reports and found that, in fact, these crude by rail projects are likely to bring in vast quantities of very dirty crude oil. And that might sound like an oxymoron. I mean, crude oil is pretty dirty, but we're talking about a whole nother level of dirty if we're bringing in the tar sands, the Canadian tar sands. And a lot of the oil companies will tell you, and the project proponents will tell you, we can't bring in tar sands, don't worry, it's too thick to transport. Well, they're not actually talking about bringing in the tar sands. They dilute it with chemicals, lots of chemical solvents, so that it flows into rail cars, into pipelines, but it's the same toxic, contaminated tar sands. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the impacts of that. Whoops. And just a note about the picture of the cute train.
Sorry.
These rail projects are enormous. We're not talking about cute little, quaint little trains. We're talking about 50-car and 100-car very heavy trains, so massive industrial activity. This is a picture of dilbit. This is the substance that we're talking about bringing in here with these 50-car and 100-car trains. Dilbit is just short for diluted bitumen. Bitumen's another word for tar sands. And as you can see, it's solid. It's really thick stuff when it comes out of the ground as bitumen, and that's why they need to dilute it with all those chemicals. Okay, so there's another photo of the raw bitumen before it's diluted. The problem with it is that it's so much harder to refine. It takes a lot more energy, and that means a lot more air pollution. It's also contaminated with a lot of toxic heavy metals. That comes out as air pollution. It creates a lot more noxious odors and a whole host of environmental issues. I'm going to go through those in a minute. And this is what it looks like when it's spilled in your front yard, which is what happened in Mayflower, Arkansas. Dilbits are sometimes called a barbell crude because there are a lot of light hydrocarbons in there from the chemical solvents. Those are really toxic substances like benzene. And then there are a lot of really heavy compounds, heavy aromatics that are very carcinogenic, very toxic, and it doesn't act anything like conventional oil. Okay, so let's talk about the health impacts a little bit. So what happens when you start refining these toxic tar sands or dilbits? We have a range of health impacts associated with air pollution, particulate, soot, nitrogen oxides, all of the air toxics, and the heavy metals. We're talking about a lot of cardiovascular illness, a lot of respiratory illness like asthma, a lot of low birth weights and birth defects, developmental problems. One thing about tar sands is that it's contaminated with really high levels of toxic heavy metals like lead. We reviewed some EPA data. I wish I had a slide here for you. We'll be coming out with that after it's peer reviewed pretty soon. Looking at EPA data of all of the refineries across the nation, looking at the heavy metal emissions coming out of the crude unit, that's the first processing unit in a refinery, refineries had to report what were the heavy metal emissions, and they also had to report what kind of fuel they were using, what type of crude oil. So we looked at the difference between the very heaviest crude oils, things like tar sands, versus the national average, and we found that emissions of lead were 5 times the national average for refineries that were using the really toxic heavy crude oils. We also found levels of mercury that were twice as high, levels of sulfur emissions twice as high, other toxic heavy metals like chromium, manganese, 4 times as high as the national average when you start moving towards the heavier crudes. So that's a pretty serious issue in terms of developmental impacts to children and all sorts of health impacts. Let's talk about the noxious odors for a minute, because if you think that regular crude oil smells pretty bad, tar sands is a whole nother level of bad. It has elevated levels of a compound called mercaptans. Those are sulfur compounds that, I'll just say it simply, are just much, much more smelly than other sulfur compounds. And it goes beyond creating a nuisance. It really causes some health impacts when you're breathing this stuff in and day out. So Petcoke, I want to talk about for a minute. It's been in the news a lot lately, not just here, but in other areas in the Midwest where there's a lot of tar sands refining already going on. That's because petroleum coke is a major byproduct when you start refining much heavier crudes. They start forming great big piles of it. And what do? Well, here are some pictures from the Marathon refinery in Detroit, where the piles are just left uncovered right outside where people live, and the toxic petcoke dust is just blowing around, carrying all of these very toxic heavy metals with it. One of the other major risks of bringing in much heavier crude oils is that they're also much more corrosive. The total acids content is a lot higher, and so these crude oils tend to just eat away or dissolve at pipes and other equipment, and so it dramatically increases the risk of industrial accidents at refineries, at the transportation hubs like the rail yards, and I think it's really impossible to know how much greater of a risk are we talking about. When you page through the hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents around the proposed projects, they're really silent on this issue. There's barely a whisper of mention about safety precautions, what measures are they going to take to deal with increased corrosive fuel. In fact, one of the reasons why that's missing is because the documentation around these projects doesn't talk about what type of crude oil they're bringing in, and so they don't discuss the increased risks like accidents, explosions, or fires. So one of the other major risks of bringing in all this fuel by rail is accidents, and we've seen so many derailments in the news, and I think other folks on this panel are going to talk about that, so I won't belabor it, but I will say that when tar sands or dilbits spill, they're much, much harder to clean up. This shows Kalamazoo, Michigan. There was a pipeline burst in 2010, and it was dilbit, and they're still cleaning it up today, 3 years later, at a cost of millions and millions of dollars. It's just impossible to clean this stuff up. So I think we just need to keep asking ourselves, is this what we want for the Bay Area? Look at Mayflower, Arkansas. Look at Kalamazoo, Michigan. Look at the petcoke piles in Detroit. Do we want this for our communities here? Now is the time to try and stop it. So I want to urge all of you guys to raise your pens again, like Greg implored you to do, and use those pens to write every elected official that represents you and tell them about your concerns with these projects. Because I think it's so important for agency officials and elected officials, anyone holding office in a jurisdiction where these projects are coming in, needs to know that people are really concerned. The project proponents aren't going to go and disclose all of these health risks. They have not done a good job. And so it's up to us to talk about the risks that our communities are facing. So I hope you'll do that. And I'll end on a hopeful note that, you know, one of the bright things about working on this project is that there are so many phenomenal community leaders who have stepped up to fight this fight. And these coalitions are growing. communities are working together, coalitions are building, and so we're at a moment in time where we need everyone's help. It's all hands on deck. And I can't wait to hear what the rest of the panel has to say. Thank you.